Hi, this is Dustin from Roland, Canada. I'm here at Long & McQuade and I'm going to be showing you the Roland TR-06 drum machine today. Now the TR-06 is the latest in the boutique line from Roland, and for those of you who don't know, the boutiques are essentially classic synthesizers from the 70s and 80s that Roland released that are now available in a brand new, smaller, compact, battery-powered package that has all of the original features, but way more under the hood. And for the TR-06, this is based on the TR-06 drum machine that was released by Roland in the 80s. Now, the TR-06 may not have the same type of notoriety as the 808 or the 909, but in its time, it was so much more affordable and so much more accessible to musicians that it made its way into countless records and helped design tons of different styles of music like old school electro, techno, some hip hop, and it even made it onto some really interesting music like DIY kind of funk projects and even some punk musicians using it as well. So the original TR-06 was an all-analog drum machine, and this TR-06 boutique uses our ACB technology to recreate those sounds faithfully. Now, very quickly, for those of you who don't know, ACB stands for Analog Circuit Behavior. So all of the sounds that you're going to hear coming from the TR-06 that are the original 606 sounds, they use that circuit modeling algorithm to essentially recreate every small detail of the sound and behavior of the original. And as we start tweaking our sounds, you're going to see exactly what that means sonically. So let's take a look at the front panel. So the TR-06 is laid out almost the exact same as the original TR-606, but it's got some additions that we'll point out as we move through this tutorial as well. So on the very top, we've got level controls. Now it's very simple. So you've got how many instruments on here? You've got a bass drum, 1, snare drum, 2. You've got a low tom and a high tom, which are controlled by the same volume. That's 3, 4. You've got a cymbal, that's 5. Then you got open hi-hat and closed hi-hat, that's 6 and 7. So we also see we have another knob on the left here, which is accent, which we'll get into when we look at the sequencing. So you've got volume control for these parts or these groups on the very top. And on the original 606, that's all you had with control. So if you wanted to change your sound, you couldn't really do it. You just had to stick with the sound that was inside. Now, a lot of people got into modifying their original 606s by opening them up and changing the analog circuit, modifying it, and you know what, that's really kind of messy. It also can break it, but you can get in under the hood of the TR-06 and customize those sounds without having to worry about breaking or modifying your hardware. So as we move over from the volume controls on the top, we have a trigger section, which is a very interesting new addition, which we're going to get into towards the end of the video. So I'll leave that one for now. But on the right-hand side, we have some added effects controls. So we have a drive, so just amount of overdrive, and some other different effects we can put on there. And then we've got a delay section with depth and time. So again, those were not available on the original TR-606. If we move right down to the bottom, some very basic controls like our start, stop. We've got some write and tap button over here, which we'll see you can tap in notes into the sequencer in real time. And most importantly, we've got our 16-step sequencer down at the very bottom. And this has a couple different functions, but today we're mostly going to be using it to select patterns and to write our patterns into the TR-06. So before we get started in terms of really customizing the sound, we got to be able to hear the sound. So I'm going to set my mode switch here to write because I want to write my pattern. And I'm just going to make sure I select the very first pattern here. You have 8 groups of 16 patterns to choose from, which you can chain and you can put together into a kind of a song mode as well. But right now we're just going to focus on creating a simple pattern. And I'm going to make sure it's cleared by holding it down and press pattern clear. So I press play, we don't have any sound. So what we want to do is use our instrument select encoder here, and we're going to go to BD for bass drum. And of course, this is our tempo on the main screen readout, which we can change at any time here, as long as we're on the very top of the menu. So let's add in some kick drums. Cool, and let's add a snare. All right, let's leave it at that for now, and we'll take a look at how we can really customize those sounds like we were mentioning. So on that original 606, you could just turn it up, turn it down, that's all you got. However, if you really want to tune up your drum kit, let's take a look at how we can do that on the TR-06. By pressing the menu button, you'll see we have a lot of options here in the menu, but we'll just stick with the most important ones for today. We're going to move over to gain. Now gain may seem like a bit of a basic kind of setting. Gain means level. Well, not necessarily. Because this is based on analog circuit behavior technology, that gain is actually pushing the volume, pushing the intensity of the instrument through that circuit model and adding a bit of saturation and flavor. Let's take a listen to that on the kick. So I'm going to select the kick here. So it adds a little bit more to that, a little bit more character. Snare as well, let's turn that up a little bit more. And we also always want to watch our volume on here, because this is our final output volume on the very top. And we can keep going over for the low tom, the high tom, the cymbals. All the parts can have a different gain, but let's leave it at that for now and move over to the next setting in the menu. The tune, now this is a big one. 606 is a bit of a higher tuned up bass drum compared to something like an 808. So if we really wanted to tune that down, all we need to do is select that and turn it down a bit lower. Snare, let's turn that up. All right, moving on. Decay is a big one as well. Let's crank that decay open for the kick drum. All right, so as you can see, you can really start to kind of get your own vibe, really dial in and get those sounds as tight or as loose as you want. You got panning for each of the parts. So right now, why don't we just add a hi-hat in? So we're gonna get out of the menu and we're gonna select the hi-hat. There we go. We'll go back in, the panning. Let's see our closed hi-hat. I want to pan that all the way to the right. Pan it to the left. I'm just going to pan it a teeny bit to the right here. And you know what? I'm going to pan my hi-hat, open hi-hat, a little bit to the left. All right. And then even more than just those controls, we have specific controls for certain voices, right? So if you know about the 808 or the 909, it's got an attack kind of control, especially on the 909, and that adds a nice little click, a nice little punch to the front of the kick drum. So we've got that just for the kick drum. We can turn that up. I like it where it's at. And then if we move over, we've got a snappy control, which is really only for the snare drum. And that is emulating the snare wires of a real snare drum, right? But of course, as we know, the history of electronic music instruments, sometimes the things that were originally meant to recreate a real sound became a really culturally significant sound in and of themselves. And the TR-606 and now the TR-06 are no exception to that. And then we move forward, we've got color for the toms, and then we move into more of the menu. So that is a really great way just to tune up your sounds the way you want. However, the 606 is quite a simple instrument, and we really wanted to give you a bit more options to play with. So let's take a look at what we call instrument variations. So if we press the menu and step loop button at the same time, we get into a menu where we can change what kick drum we're using, what snare drum, and we've got some interesting other swappable instruments as well. So for the kick, we've got 3 different kicks. We've got the 606, and we've got a lower kick, a big fat kick, and a punchy kick. Let's leave it on the 606 for now. Snare, a couple different snares. And again, I want to keep it on the original 606. But as we move over to things like the low tom, high tom, or the cymbal. How about the cymbal? Well, I might not use the cymbal as much as the other parts in the type of music that I make. So that cymbal, let's see what else we have on that track. Nice, we got a clap. Now the original 606 didn't have a clap. I think I'm going to use that, but let's take a look at what else is here. A rim shot. Let's do a clap, that's great. So now, if we go over to the cymbal track, and we put some notes in. Nice, so that's really great. that's no longer a full 606. There's got a clap in it, and that's really adding to my personal drum kit that I want to make on this, right? So this is all going really well. So if we go over and just add a open hi-hat, and we want that to play off the other hi-hat, the closed hi-hat. So I'm going to make sure I put it in on some notes where the closed hi-hat isn't playing. Nice. And you can hear that the closed hi-hat is choking the open hi-hat. So you can turn that on or off in the menu if you want the open hi-hat just to ring out. But I want that original kind of behavior. All right, so we've got our simple sequence going right now. And just as a note, I'm going to keep it at 1 bar right now, but each pattern can be up to 32 steps. So if you want to make that 16 step currently go up to 32, then that's not a problem. You can do that like this. And you see that the second part of the pattern is empty. There we go. So again, today we'll just leave it at 1 bar, 16, because that's what we want. So let's take a look at the effects that are available on the TR-06. So that's the top right section. So first off, let's take a look at the controls, and then we'll have a look at how we can actually change which effects we're using. So right now, let's try the drive. I'm going to turn that up as we're playing our sequence. Great, so it's a nice basic kind of saturation overdrive type sound. Let's go into the menu. And we'll go to OD, press the tap button, and we can select different types of effects to be on this drive. So let's try the second one. Nice. That's like a bit reducer, sample crusher kind of thing. Bit crusher. Number 3, more of a distortion. And number 4, we got a nice little filter to use there. So a low pass, high pass combo filter. Very cool. Now you might be saying, oh, well, the distortion's on the entire drum mix. I don't want distortions on my hi-hats. It makes it too woolly. It makes it too fluffy. It's not for me. Well, that's fine. If we go back into our menu and we take a look at OD on, essentially, we can turn the overdrive on or off for any of the instruments. Let's go ahead and turn it off for the everything except the kick drum. How about? Now let's take a listen. Right? So you can do that with all of the effects, right? So if this was set up to be instead of the distortion, if we wanted it to be that filter, we could simply drop out our kick sometimes. Right? Really easy. That's up to you, however you want to have it set up. So let's move on to the delay section over here. So now, if we just take a listen and we'll turn up the delay depth, we got a very simple delay going on. Right? And you can hear maybe that is synced up to the tempo of the drum machine. So when we turn the time, we can have that moving through different divisions or multiplications of our BPM. However, that is also an option in the menu. If you want to turn that off, it can just be free running time. That's up to you. But it's not just delay that's available on that section. So let's take a look again in the menu. What do we have under delay type? Got a panning delay. Tape echo, reverb, got a flanger, and we got a sideband filter. I'm gonna just leave it on the delay. And you might have noticed there's no kick drum in there. That's because before I already switched it up so that the kick wasn't going to the delay, and we can see that in the menu. No problem. Delay send for each instrument, not only on or off, but it's a specific amount. So you can really dial that in just the way that you want. So our sequence has been pretty straightforward so far. You know, we set that up just to get started. But let's take a look at how we can maybe expand that sequence and make it a little bit more interesting, all right? So we're only using 5 parts, but we haven't used the low tom or the high tom yet. Now those can be alternate sounds. Let's just keep them original for right now, all right? So we'll do the same thing that we did before just to get a few extra sounds in our sequence we can start playing with. Turn off my delay. Add in some tom. And some high tom. Nice. And just to show, remember, if we want to go in and change that high tom, we can do that. Let's leave it original though. All right. So now that we've filled this out a little bit more, let's take a look at the different types of advanced sequencing options that we have here, all right? So the first one would be substeps, and this is on a lot of other Roland instruments, and it really allows you to remove yourself just from that 16th note only type of grid. So it allows you to do faster notes on single steps. So let's take a look at the snare, because it'll be a little bit more pronounced. So going to my snare track, what I'm gonna do is press the menu button, which is substep, and press one of the steps a couple times. And you see as it cycles through substeps, which are mathematical multiplications of the steps, so double, triple, quadruple, or flam. And as you may have heard me describe in other videos, flams are really like that drummer, brap, hitting a snare or a tom or any instrument with just 2 sticks, kind of sloppy. So you've got those options. So simply by holding down substep, and you can just cycle through them. Let's add a few substeps in here. So just a substep there and some extra hits there, right? So it's a nice little, almost like a little fill. All right. Something that's very, very interesting about the TR-06 as well is that it has probability settings. So per step we can have a different substep, but we can also have a different probability of that step happening or not happening. So let's take a look at that. How about that one that we made the substep on? If we hold the step down, we see P100. So that means it's going to happen 100% of the time. But turn that down, 50. That means it's a coin toss. It's going to happen 50% of the time. Let's take a listen. So this step is only happening half the time. Not only that, we can also go in, holding the step, pressing tap, and change the velocity per step. So it can be lower as well. Really allowing for more dynamic stuff going on. So why don't we go ahead and change these last 2 snare hits to 50% as well. Then just take a little listen. I'm going to add a couple kick drums as well. Here on step 3 and 4, and we'll turn those to 30%. So let's just take a listen, and then it's going to be a little different every time. So here we have all these different types of cool variations happening, but it's just within one bar. So remember that this is just going to be different every time it comes around. So it's a nice way to add a little bit of magic here and there, a nice little surprise. And also you can combine, as you've seen, the substeps with the probability and velocity on each step, quite different. So that's really, really powerful. And again, it just lets you kind of do your thing for a bit on here and then back off, maybe play with your synth for a while. And this is going to be adding a nice little bit of variation on its own. Now, in terms of velocity per step, we got to also talk about the accent, right? So that's that knob that you see up at the top here, that accent level. Essentially, an accent is a key part of classic electronic drum machines. If I go down to the accent track on the track select here and press play, what I'm going to do is select some steps And as I turn up the accent, it's simply going to increase the level of those steps only for every instrument. So it breathes a little more. So you've got harder hits on 1, 5, 9, 13, and 15, right? But it's everything in between is still there. It's just it's floating a little bit more. Helps a lot with the vibe. And then if we hold down tempo, we can add shuffle as well. Let's leave it at totally straight for now. So now we've got our substeps, our velocity per step, our probability, and our accent. There's one more really powerful control I'd like to show you, and that's master probability. So any of the steps that we put in the sequencer with a probability less than 100, you know, they're already in that probability kind of game. So they're going to do their own thing. However, you're able to put in steps with 0 probability. Let's take a look at that really quick. I'm going to go to the snare drum again because it's really easy to hear it. I'm going to grab the first 4 notes, turn them down to 0 probability. I'm going to add a bunch more at 0 probability. All right. So the ones that I put in at 0 are never going to play unless I turn up the master probability. Now what the master probability does is it shifts anything that's already got a probability setting up or down. So something that's 0 can go from 0% to 100%. But something that we had a probability of 50, we can nudge it higher or lower. Check this out. As I turn the master probability up, all those invisible snare drums I put in are going to come through. If I hold down menu and turn the value encoder, and if I turn it down, it's cut out everything that has probability, right? So we've got this really nice manual control. Right, so a whole nother layer to live controllability over the TR-06 and these really interesting kind of things that happen every once in a while. I'd like to move on now to the trigger section as we saw in the beginning of the video. Now the triggers are something that were not available like this on the original TR-606, and they allow you to control external analog equipment that takes a standard trigger pulse, like an analog trigger pulse, and you've got 5 trigger outputs and 1 trigger input. Let's take a look at how this would interface with a small modular setup. So I've got in front of me a small Eurorack modular setup, and we're going to be using this to have a quick play with some of the trigger options on the TR-06. But first, let's take a look at the trigger section. As we pointed out in the beginning, we've got a single trigger input and 5 trigger outputs. Now very quickly, that trigger input can be set up in a couple different ways. The main one that most people will be using is to have external clock, that is 16th note pulses based on 16th notes musically, coming from another analog piece of equipment. But it doesn't have to be consistent clocks. You can move this drum machine forward maybe randomly with whatever clocks you're having coming from your modular or your old school gear. That's up to you. But there are a couple other settings we can put for the input. So if we take a look on the trigger in, we can have it set to our clock, we can have it start the sequencer, reset it, randomize the sequence, we can have it shift the selected part left and right, and that allows us to do some pretty interesting stuff when we have it interfaced with analog equipment. So let's leave it on shift. We'll have a play with that in a minute, because right now this is the master. So let's take a look at the options for the trigger output. So we can have it triggered from the low tom, high tom, accent, bass drum, or snare drum. Today, I'm going to use the low tom and high tom because I just want a pretty basic beat with my kick, my snare, my hi-hats, etc. So let's take a listen to where we're at, and then we'll get those triggers set up with the modular. Very simple. So we're just going to leave it like that. You know what? I'm going to even change the kick to make it a little more simple. Excellent. And because those trigger outputs are connected to the specific instruments labeled beside them, I'm going to first go with the low tom. And I want to use the low tom to clock my whole modular setup. So essentially, I'm going to be taking a single cable and running it to my sequencers, anything that wants to have a consistent 16th note clock. I'm going to plug it right in to the low tom. All right? And let's go to that low tom track, press play, and you'll see I have 16 notes across the entire sequence. Now let's turn a lot of those off. So you can see if there's only 3, the sequencer in my modular, let's take a better listen, is only moving on those 3 steps. Now, because I want this to be clock, I want this filled up all the way. So you can see a nice repeating sequence here. If I press stop, it stops, right? So every single time there's a pulse from that output, it's going to move my sequencer in the modular to advance to the next step. So it lets us do some interesting stuff, but let's leave this one just consistent clock, all right? I'm going to switch up my sequence a little bit. Excellent. Let's leave it as it is. Now, let's take a look at the other output. Now this one I'd like to use a little bit more manually, a little bit more hands-on. So I'm going to take an output from the high tom trigger out. And if you heard that, it had a little bit of a trigger there. And I'm going directly to a percussion module. So this is just waiting for a single trigger. Now I do have a sequence running in, so you'll hear some different notes. However, this will only trigger when we have a sequence in the sequencer for the high tom. So right now, we've got nothing. So let's take a listen to what happens when I put down a couple triggers here. And we'll open it up just to clarify our sound. All right, let's add a couple more. Nice. Change up my sequence a tiny bit. Awesome. Now, something that's really important to remember is that all of those advanced types of sequencing capabilities that we had for the internal sounds, except for velocity, those are going to work with the external triggers as well, right? So if I wanted to add some probability, let's say, to my percussion module triggers, I can go ahead and do that. Let's take a look at that, and we'll also add a couple sub-steps. Probability on the last step here. That one only going to happen sometimes. Let's add a sub-step here. Add one at the top here. Turn the probability down. And of course, when we press stop, everything stops, because this is live triggering of these analog devices from the TR-06, all right? So one of the other things I wanted to point out about the sequencer in general is a great performance tool, and that is the step loop tool. Now this is available on some other pieces as well, but if we press step loop, essentially we can choose any step to repeat the internal sound and also the trigger outputs, which is why I wanted to keep it for this section. Let's take a look. So it's repeating those triggers. So a lot of really fun things that you can get going with the step loop, with the trigger outputs. Now finally, let's take a look at the trigger input and what we can get that doing to one of our selected sequences. So if you remember, I have my setting for the trigger in set to shift right. So shift R means shift right. So what that means is that whenever the TR-06 receives a trigger on the trigger input, it will shift just the selected sequence to the right. Now that's really fun if you've got some probabilistic pieces in your modular or some interesting trigger sources. You can really have a handshake of trigger out, influence trigger in on the TR-06. So really it's like an interesting trigger module for your Eurorack or other modular on top of being an awesome drum machine. So let's take a look at this, and we're gonna be affecting our high tom trigger out. So let's make it a little simpler. Bop, 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 bop. I'm gonna take a little manual trigger and watch what happens when I plug this in. There we go. Trigger, let's add another one. So you see it's shifting right every time it gets a trigger. Shift, 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 shift. Step loop. And you see we can even hold the step loop and shift that while we're holding. So there you have it. Very simple to interface the TR-06 with any modular equipment that accepts standard trigger voltages, to advanced sequencers, to trigger modules, pretty much whatever you want. Once you get into the analog realm, there's a huge playground for you to start getting creative with, and we've seen a huge resurgence of interest in analog synthesis, especially modular, in the past, say, 5 or 6 years. And this is going to continue to grow as people get more creative and people start to reach out to more inspiring tools to create their music. So thanks for joining us today to check out the TR-06. Head over to longandmcquade.com to learn more. It's available right now.